This video is sponsored by the following people. Please click the links in the description below.
If you don't go right high, they can't get too big. And this is another myth that I want to bust. I just do not believe it's ever necessary to normalise a piece of material more than once. One time only. I'm Graham Clarke. I'm a metallurgist by profession and I run Clarke Knives in rural Wiltshire, where we run knife making courses and we also run a heat treatment service for knife makers, and we make Damascus steel billets which we sell out to other knife makers. I think it's an old story. Steel has been around for quite a while. There were people making steel knives and swords and blades 1,000 years ago, but they didn't understand metallurgy. Metallurgy hadn't been discovered, as it were, all those years ago. But what blacksmiths did know, if they had a piece of steel that had a bit of carbon in it, they could dunk that steel into a bucket of water when it was red hot and it would come hard, and that's how they made something with a nice sharp edge. What they also knew was that it didn't always work, because sometimes it would come nice and hard, and then when they started using it, it would snap in half, and other times it didn't. And then they discovered that, well, okay, they finished forging something. So let's take a sword now for an example. He's made his nice sword, he's hammered it all out to shape. What he then discovered was he has to let it cool down, put it back in his fire, get it up to a nice cherry red, and you might be pushing it through those coals backwards and forwards, and the whole thing's a nice cherry red, takes it out and lets it cool down again. Then he heats it up a second time, gets it to a nice cherry red, whoof, into the water, and the thing comes up nice and hard, and it makes a damn good sword. And he said, well, obviously I was doing something to the metal while I was forging it that upset it. When I do that first cooling operation, heating it up and letting it cool down, I'm putting it back into its normal condition, so that when I heat treat it, it comes hard. And I think that's how the name normalising come round. They started doing that first heat treatment cycle, heat it up, let it cool down, and it put the material back into its normal condition. And then when the blacksmith then hardened it, it came hard and it was very useful. Now, what we do know now is it's all to do with the size of the crystals. In previous videos, I've explained to you how iron is made up of crystals. Just mix a bit of carbon in there, it becomes steel, still made up of the same crystals and the same shape. What happens is, as you heat the metal up, it eventually loses magnetism at about 720 something degrees. It's already glowing a bit red by then, and it starts to glow red and gets bigger. Now it changes into what I call the hot structure. That's the face center cubic structure. The atoms are on the corners and there's one in the middle of each face on the cube, and it gets hotter and hotter. Now as it gets hotter and hotter, those atoms keep moving about. And what happens is there's a mixture of crystal sizes in there. Those tiny crystals, the atoms just sort of move and go and join one of the bigger crystals. So your tiny crystals dissolve is the correct word for it. They actually dissolve, even though it doesn't melt. It's called solid state solution. They dissolve and they move and they join bigger crystals until you get up to the point where the metal melts and the crystals are very big. Now when you're forging steel, those of you who forge will know this only too well. The hotter you get it, the softer it gets and the easier it is to shape. Take a piece of ordinary, say a 1080 simple carbon steel. I think you'll find that recognised forging range from material like that is from either 1100 or 1150 or 1200 degrees maximum, and you must finish forging by the time you get down to 850. Why? Because that's what is called the hot working range. As I said to you, the crystals, as it gets hotter and hotter, the crystals grow. You now put it on an anvil and belt it with a hammer and you break those crystals up. So therefore, if you break the crystals up, you're starting to stress them, they get smaller, the metal gets harder. Because you're still up in the hot working range, you're up in 800-900 degrees, 1000 degrees, those crystals, you break them up and the small ones, woof, disappear and dissolve back into the big one. Now if that recrystallization, as it's called, the little ones growing into the bigger one, if that acts faster, then you can break them up, hitting them with a hammer. That's the definition of hot working, because you can keep hammering away. As long as it stays hot, you can keep hammering away. It's nice and soft. You can shape the metal. You're not doing any damage to it. The crystals that you do break up by hitting with your hammer, they dissolve. The little ones dissolve and go back into the big ones. That's the definition of hot work. But some of those crystals are quite big. When you come to heat treat it, if your crystals are too big when you harden it, they're actually so big, obviously they're not this big, but relatively, if they're big and you've got this hard block, all the crystals are lined up in nice little rows. If your crystal is too big and it gets some stress on it, they're not very strong, they crack. But if the crystals are small and this one's oriented this way and this one's oriented that way, they're not all in straight rows like that, but this crystal is like that and the next crystal is all like that and the next crystal is all like that. Because they're all in different directions and they're nice and small, then it gives a lot of strength to the material. If you take a spec, an industrial spec on a piece of steel, it will actually give you a grain size that material should be when you come to heat treat it. I'm not going to bore you with the technical detail, but there's a specific size the grains have to be. And if they're too big, then your metal becomes brittle. And I'm sure a lot of you who are blacksmiths will know that, oh, I've heard people say, oh, it's just an occupational risk of blacksmithing, or when you come to harden it, sometimes they crack. If your grain size is too big, they will crack. So you need to normalise it properly. So now how do you normalise it? How do you get rid of these big grains? Well, you let it cool down. The structure changes from this face centre cubic, one on each corner of the crystal, one in the middle of each face, changes over into body centre cubic, one on the corner, one in the middle. When you heat it up again, the body centres change back to face centres, but as they change over, they're all tiny, tiny, tiny. And as you now heat it up, they all grow and they grow. And the little ones dissolve and the bigger ones grow. The biggest size of the biggest ones is controlled by the temperature you get to. If you don't go right high, they can't get too big. And this is another myth that I want to bust. I'm sure I'm going to get people arguing and toss against me. You can toss the argument back to me all you like, and I'm going to fight back, because I just do not believe it's ever, ever, ever necessary to normalise a piece of material more than once. One time only. Oh, I hear the argument, yeah, I'll do it 3 times from this temperature, next one a bit lower, next one a bit lower, because that gives me the finest grain size. Well, if your grain size is too fine, it won't harden up properly. If your grain size is too big, it'll harden up nicely, but it'll be brittle. Get your grain size right, and it'll harden up perfectly, and you'll have a nice tough piece of steel. So how do I know what the right grain size is? Well, you actually get a bit scientific. You have to normalise from the right temperature. So first of all, it's got to get cold. It doesn't have to be stone cold. On some fairly high alloy steels, I once used to normalise regularly on a commercial basis. I think we said if it was below 400 degrees for 20 minutes, that was enough. And this was a job where we had to let it cool down and reheat it again as quick as we could. So if you just let your piece of metal stand to one side for a while, it doesn't have to be stone cold, but it has to be pretty cold. And it's been out the fire for 15, 20 minutes, you're going to be quite safe. Take it back in. You heat it up until it is, I think the theoretical definition is, you get a hardening temperature given with a material. So you get a piece of 1080 steel, hardening temperature I think is 780 to 800 or 780 to 810. You get a range. That's given in the steel specification. You heat that metal to 30 degrees above the top temperature. So to give you a range, take the top temperature, add 30 degrees, that is your normalising temperature. And that is the only normalising temperature you need to know about. Heat it up to that temperature, let it soak through, let it cool down again. Your grain size will be absolutely spot on. The difference, there is a difference. That's for your carbon steels. Stainless steels are a bit different, because stainless steels you always harden from well up over 1,000 degrees, and that does control grain size. Sometimes they put a bit of vanadium in there. Yes, the vanadium gives you nice hard carbides. You'll have heard about that in a previous video, but vanadium also stops grain growth, and they sometimes put a bit of that in there. So if you want to if you have been forging a piece of stainless steel and you want to normalise it, just heat it up to 850, 860 and let it cool down. If you let it cool down in air, it's going to harden up, not harden up fully, but it will harden up a bit, but it will have sorted out all that mixed grain sizes that you've had from forging. Then you can heat the whole thing back up to the correct hardening temperature, quench it, and everything will be okay. So that is normalising. There is absolutely no need to normalise more than once. If you normalise 3 times, what you do on your third normalise will determine what you've got in your steel. And what you've done before that will make no difference at all. Those of you who argue that, well, I get the finest grain size by doing it 3 times, fine. But it's only the last one that determines the fine grain size. And the reason you get it so fine is because your third one you've done at the lowest temperature. So that will give you the finest grain size. You'll have had a coarser grain size from the middle normalised, and you'll have had a coarser grain size again from your first normalised. So only the last one that matters, because every time that structure changes from body centered to face centered and back and forth and back and forwards, when it changes and you're heating up from body centered to face centered, it goes tiny, and how high you heat it determines how far it gets to. When you're normalizing, you don't have to get the whole piece of metal all hot at the same time like you do when you're hardening. It's the maximum temperature that each piece of steel's got to that controls it. That is your normalizing process, and there's just no argument around that. And you do need, ideally, a temperature controlled furnace. Your next best option is to do it out of your forge, but to have one of these little radiation pyrometers. I've got quite a nice one, and you can shoot at the metal and it will tell you what the temperature is, and that's a pretty good control. Your third best option is to learn your colors. It tells you exactly what color it is by the temperature it is. You can download charts off the internet, which will, if you've got a nice color printer, you can have those colors next to you. They help. Working with a magnet doesn't always work because it loses its magnetism. I think the theoretical temperature is 723. I think your practical temperature, which you'll measure it at, is about 760. That's not always high enough. You sometimes need to go a lot more than that. If you're heat treating a piece of 01 tool steel, you need to be up 840, 850 when you normalise it, let it cool down. That's nearly 100 degrees above when it loses magnetism. It's just a case of getting it right. Okay.
You know, this will probably be the most controversial part of the video, isn't it?
Well, I'm hoping so. I'm hoping it does create some discussion, because, you know, you talk about bringing intelligent people in. One of the most intelligent people I know is Mr. Google. He knows absolutely everything, but he's not infallible. He gets it wrong sometimes. Believe me, he does get it wrong sometimes.
Thank you.